Sometimes we have no choice but to confront dangerous circumstances head on. Esther faced such a challenge. Her adoptive parent, Mordecai, who actually was Esther's cousin, gave her this advice: "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for time such as this?" That's Esther chapter 4, verse 14. This is a real-life Cinderella story that took place in Susa, the capital of Persia, in 479 BC. The setting was the king's lavish palace. King Xerxes threw a massive 6-month-long party to demonstrate his great wealth and power so that his people would have confidence in the king's ability to wage war against other nations. One evening, after the king had consumed too much wine, he commanded the queen, Vashti, to be presented to the assembled male guests so that they could all admire the queen's beauty. She refused. The king was no doubt embarrassed. He was trying to impress the people of his land, impressing upon them that he wielded power and authority and ability to successfully lead his nation into battle. But in truth, he was not even able to command the appearance of his wife, the queen. After consulting with his advisors, the king issued several edicts in order to head off a potential national crisis that would occur if wives were allowed to follow the example of Queen Vashti and defy the orders of their husbands. That's Esther chapter 1, verses 10 through 19. This is the part of the story where I resist any editorial comment. Queen Vashti was banished from the kingdom and a royal decree issued declaring every man should be ruler over his own household. That's Esther 1:22. And a nationwide search was begun for a new queen. Esther was a beautiful young woman who had been raised by her older cousin Mordecai. They were among the Jews whose families had been driven out of Jerusalem 100 years earlier. Esther won favor from the king, who did not realize that she was a Jewish descendant. While Esther was in the king's palace, Mordecai paced outside the palace gate. He observed a conspiracy in the making that was a plan to assassinate the king. Mordecai passed that information on to Esther, who in turn notified the king. Meanwhile, one of the king's advisors, Haman, became offended that the Jew Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman in Haman's presence. Therefore, Haman convinced the king to issue an irreversible decree that all Jews in the Persian kingdom were to be killed on a certain day. In anticipation of that day, Haman erected a pole upon which he would personally see to it that Mordecai was hung. When the king's death decree was issued, Mordecai got word to Esther and asked that she approach the king in order to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. That's Esther chapter 4, verse 8. Esther, however, knew that anyone approaching the king without an express invitation to do so would be put to death. Faced with the dilemma of the king's decree to exterminate all Jews and the palace policy of killing anyone who approaches the throne without an invitation, Esther found herself in an impossible situation. She faced death either way. That's when Mordecai provided his famous advice, quote, "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for a time such as this?" Esther 4, verse 14. Esther responded by asking Mordecai to assemble the Jews for a time of fasting. Although not expressed, the clear implication was that people were to fast and pray for God's intervention. See Esther 4, verse 16. Once 3 days of fasting and prayer were completed, Esther would venture into the king's presence. Esther, knowing the risk, added, "If I perish, I perish." That's Esther 4, verse 16. After the Jews gathered for 3 days of prayer and fasting, Esther coyly presented herself in the outer court where the king would see her. The king was pleased to see her, and he summoned Esther to approach the throne. The king magnanimously offered, "What is your request? It shall be given to you." That's Esther chapter 5, verse 3. Queen Esther was cautious. She said that her request was that the king and his personal advisor Haman attend a banquet offered by the queen. The king readily accepted for both himself and Haman. Queen Esther hosted the banquet and then requested that the king and Haman attend a second banquet. At the second banquet, the king asked Queen Esther how the king could honor her. Esther's response was simple. She said, "Grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people." Esther 7, verse 3. When the king understood that the irretractable decree to kill the Jews included his own queen, Queen Esther, and Mordecai, who had uncovered an assassination plot against the king, King Xerxes became distraught and angry. Read Esther 7, verses 8 and 9. Haman, who had concocted the decree to kill the Jews, was put to death and in fact was hung from the very pole that Haman had erected for Mordecai. King Xerxes' decree to kill the Jews could not be retracted, so the king authorized a new decree, one allowing the Jews to assemble and defend themselves. That's Esther 8, verse 11. On the appointed day, the Jews assembled and successfully defended themselves. Although the king's decree allowed the Jews to take property from their enemies, the victorious Jewish community did not plunder from those whom they killed. Read Esther 9, verse 18. A time of celebration was established for the Jews to commemorate their victory over their enemies. That celebration is known as Purim and is celebrated by the Jewish people to this very day. In the midst of overwhelming danger, God was present, protecting his chosen people. This theme is often repeated in Scripture right up through the end-time battle of Armageddon. See Revelation 16, verses 16 through 20. Esther provides fodder for reflection. Consider, if you will, these questions for introspection. Question number 1. When faced with the king's edict calling for the extermination of Jews, Esther instructed Mordecai to assemble the Jews for a time of prayer and fasting. Are there circumstances today that warrant a time for Christians to gather together in prayer and fasting? To what social crisis have you responded, or should you be responding, with prayer and fasting? Question number 2. Mordecai suggested that Esther had been placed in the king's palace for a time such as this. God places each of us in his chosen time and place for his purpose. For what purpose has God placed you in your current circumstances? And question number 3, the Jewish holiday Purim was established to commemorate the reversal of fate for God's people. Esther had acted on her faith and rallied the people to fast and pray. Those actions led to God's miraculous protection. How should this example from Scripture affect our everyday living? The story of Esther reminds us that God never leaves us or forsakes his people. When we seek God through prayer, fasting, and obedience, he will hear from heaven and will help us through even the worst of life's circumstances. May we never be too distressed to turn to God for his direction and his empowerment.